Sicily, July 1943, 04:30 a.m. The air over the beaches of Sicily was thick, not just with the Mediterranean humidity, but with the raw, metallic scent of fresh battle. Landing craft disgorged men and machines into the warm, blood-soaked sand. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of the initial chaos, amid the desperate firefights and the struggle for a foothold, one sound cut through the noise of machine guns and exploding mortars, the insistent, rhythmic rumble of engines. The Allied invasion of Italy, Operation Husky, was not merely a clash of soldiers. It was a collision of entirely different strategic philosophies, a war where sheer industrial muscle would prove to be the ultimate weapon. The Axis powers, fueled by an ideology of inherent martial superiority, had prioritized the spectacular, the mighty tank, the sleek fighter, the fearsome U-boat. But the invasion revealed the Allies' true focus, the mundane, yet essential logistical spine of modern warfare. In the dusty, narrow roads leading inland, the first waves of American mechanized power began to flow. These were not the celebrated Shermans or the lauded P-51s. They were the anonymous workhorse vehicles of the U.S. Army, the GMC CCKW-2. 5-ton, deuce-and-a-half truck, the ubiquitous Willys MB Jeep, and the robust Dodge WC series. They were the ghosts of industry, machines designed not for glory, but for relentless, monotonous functionality. For the Italian defenders, exhausted and clinging to their positions, the sight was a psychological shockwave. They had seen American men, they had felt the sting of American shells. But what they now witnessed was a flood of materiel that defied rational comprehension. We were told the Americans were soft, that they were a nation of shopkeepers, not warriors, recounted a former Italian engineer officer, writing years later about the first days of the invasion. Our propaganda showed them as weak. But when you looked at the invasion beaches, the weakness wasn't in their men. It was in our understanding of their power. The trucks, they kept coming, one after another. It was endless. Where did they all come from? The Axis response had been immediate, though tragically misplaced. Prior to the invasion, both German and Italian intelligence analysts had dismissed Roosevelt's promises of American industrial output as pure theatrical propaganda. The president had announced ambitious and seemingly impossible production goals. Among these targets was the sheer volume of military vehicles, 500,000 trucks in under a year, a number that dwarfed the combined total vehicle production of Germany and Italy for the same period. In Rome and Berlin, the experts scoffed. The complexity of mass production, the scarcity of raw materials, the inevitable bureaucratic snags, it was deemed a fantastical boast, a political show for domestic morale. They failed to grasp the fundamental difference between Axis quantity, small precise batches of finely engineered high-maintenance machines, and American quantity, a tidal wave of standardized, rugged, and easily maintained vehicles. This failure of imagination was the core irony of the conflict and the thesis of this story. The very machine that Axis powers dismissed as a simple tool of commerce, the mass-produced truck, would become the instrument of their undoing. It was the invisible hand of the factory floor delivering the decisive blow. The deuce-and-a-half, with its straight-six engine and tandem rear axles, was the logistical atom bomb. It carried the fuel for the tanks, the shells for the artillery, the rations for the infantry, and the blood for the wounded. It turned the logistical equation of the war on its head. While German divisions were often still reliant on hundreds of thousands of horses to move supplies, a slow, fragile, and inefficient system, the American forces were wholly motorized, capable of sustaining offensive operations at a pace the Wehrmacht simply could not match. This technological chasm meant that every American soldier moved faster, fought harder, and stayed in the field longer. It meant Allied commanders could execute deep penetration maneuvers without fear of their supply lines collapsing. The logistical tail, often the weakest link in any army, was, for the Americans, a steel cable. As the hot Sicilian sun rose higher, casting long shadows of the advancing columns of men and steel, the fate of the Italian campaign, and ultimately the entire European war, was being decided not by the bravery of the frontline fighters alone, but by the relentless anonymous churn of a factory back in Detroit. The noise of the engines was not just transport, It was the sound of a promised 500,000 becoming a terrifying, undeniable reality. CTA. The true horror for the enemy was just beginning. In the next act, we explore the engineering genius that made this logistical miracle possible, and the first brutal road race that proved the American gamble correct. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the unfolding story of industrial supremacy that broke the back of the Axis war machine. The roar of the engines witnessed in Sicily was the culmination of a revolution born months earlier, not on the battlefield, but in the drafting rooms and sprawling assembly plants of the American Midwest. The challenge laid down by President Roosevelt, 500,000 trucks in 9 months, was met with skepticism by America's European allies as well, but for a different reason. They knew the difficulty of retooling an entire peacetime industry. The German solution, exemplified by vehicles like the Opel Blitz, was excellent engineering, but was burdened by over-specification and the pursuit of complex perfection. The American approach was radical in its simplicity and standardization. The true hero of this act is not a general, but the Standardization Committee, a group of engineers and manufacturers who decided that winning the war required sacrificing custom quality for sheer, ruthless volume. They embraced the concept of interchangeability, a single axle type, a common transmission, and the same robust, easy-to-fix engine block used across multiple vehicle classes, from the Jeep to the Deuce and a Half. The GMC CCKW, the backbone of the entire effort, was a masterpiece of utility and compromise. It was a vehicle that could be assembled by workers with minimal training, repaired by mechanics with basic tools, and driven by soldiers under extreme duress. Its engine, designed to run reliably on low-octane, often poor-quality fuel, was a testament to robust, forgiving design. The German trucks were beautiful machines, beautifully built, noted a veteran U.S. Army motor pool sergeant who saw service in North Africa and Italy. But if something broke, you needed 3 special wrenches and a degree in mechanics to fix it. Our CCKW, a hammer, a wrench, and a prayer. If the engine went, you pulled it and dropped a new one in. They weren't built for a long life. They were built for a long war. This industrial strategy meant that factories which had been churning out Buicks and Chevrolets just months before could transition almost seamlessly. The power of the American assembly line, honed by decades of civilian car production, was now weaponized. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler became the arsenals of democracy, turning out war material at a pace that shattered every previous manufacturing record in human history. Consider the numbers. In 1940, the U.S. produced roughly 110,000 military trucks. By 1943, that number had surged to 633,000, exceeding Roosevelt's ambitious goal. For every 1 truck Germany produced, America was producing 6. This staggering statistical advantage was not merely numerical, it was strategic. It meant the U.S. Army did not need to conserve transport. They could expend it, knowing a replacement was perpetually minutes away. The first major proof of concept for this industrial behemoth came not in Italy, but during the grueling fight for North Africa. While the German Africa Corps, commanded by Rommel, was famous for its speed and audacity, its logistical chain was agonizingly thin. When one fuel truck was lost, the entire spearhead stalled. In contrast, following the Allied landings in late 1942, the sheer volume of U.S. transport allowed for the infamous Red Ball Express in embryo, the ceaseless movement of supplies across vast, treacherous desert distances. The German commanders watched with incredulity as Allied columns, far from their ports, maintained speed and striking power. An intercepted German message from a senior officer in Tunisia, early 1943, revealed the dawning realization of this threat. The enemy is not only endless in men, but limitless in supply. They move their entire army, not just their divisions. Their mobility is terrifying. We cannot starve them, we can only be crushed by their weight. The transition from a peacetime economy to a total war economy was not without its own suspense and drama. Engineers fought supply chain bottlenecks, union leaders brokered crucial agreements to keep the lines moving, and the workers, many of them women stepping into the factories for the first time, the Rosie the Riveters, became the unsung protagonists of the conflict. The very quality that the Axis powers mocked, standardization, was the precise factor that guaranteed victory. Every nut, every bolt, every fender was identical, reducing maintenance time from hours to minutes, multiplying the effective fighting strength of the troops by a factor of logistics. The psychological impact of seeing a new, fresh truck pull up to replace a disabled one, often within the hour, was a profound morale booster for the Allies and a crushing weight for the enemy. The production line had become the longest, most important supply line of the entire war. The 500,000 propaganda trucks were now poised to unleash the full force of American industrial might across the entire European theater. As the Sicilian campaign gave way to the brutal, grinding advance up the Italian peninsula in late 1943, the true test of the American truck was not in the clear skies, but in the treacherous terrain. Italy was a nightmare for military transport. Mountainous, riddled with narrow roads and medieval towns, and perpetually soaked in rain that turned every supply route into a muddy quagmire. Here, the German and Italian logistical strategy of utilizing many different specialized vehicles, some half-track, some wheeled, some heavy, began to unravel. When a specific part for a specific vehicle failed, the machine was often abandoned. The Allied forces, however, relied overwhelmingly on the all-wheel drive, AWD capabilities of their standardized fleet. The GMC CCKW, initially scorned for its basic design, became the indispensable beast of burden. Its 6x6 configuration allowed it to slog through mud and climb gradients where many heavier, less flexible vehicles became hopelessly stuck. This stage of the war generated the first legends of the American logistical driver. These were not tank commanders or fighter pilots. They were the truckers of the line, often referred to as the ghost drivers due to their nocturnal, high-risk routes. They drove without lights, relying on the faint moonlight, gut instinct, and the dim glow of cat-eye markers to deliver their critical cargo. Their adventure was one of monotonous, terrifying endurance. "I saw things no one should see," said a veteran CCKW driver from the 53rd Quartermaster Battalion, recalling the drive through the Italian Apennines. Landslides, roads mined just hours before, and the rain. It was relentless. You'd drive a mile for 3 hours. The Germans knew we couldn't fight without fuel and ammo, so they didn't bomb the front lines. They bombed the dirt roads behind us. Every mile was a gamble, but you had to keep moving. If you stopped, the whole front stopped. The strategic vision behind the truck's deployment was now becoming clear. Logistics as offensive weaponry. The sheer number of vehicles allowed for the creation of redundancy. If a road was cut, 2 more convoys could be diverted immediately. If a bridge was destroyed, the engineer battalions transported by their own fleets of trucks would erect a temporary bridge and the flow would resume within hours. This sustained mobility directly contributed to one of the war's great mysteries, the unexpected speed of American advances following strategic breakthroughs, which consistently surprised the German High Command. In one instance, after the decisive push at Salerno, the Allied forces needed to move an entire armored division, along with its fuel and ammunition, over 150 miles of shattered infrastructure in under 48 hours to exploit a gap in the German line. The feat was achieved by throwing 3,000 trucks onto the route, driving continuously, many without sleep. The German counterattack was caught completely off guard, assuming the Allied units would be logistically exhausted and out of position. The enemy's psychological terror deepened. They began to realize the American logistical advantage was not just about the availability of tools, but the doctrine of their use. The Americans used their trucks like a vast, flexible pipeline, a resource to be spent and replaced, ensuring an unrelenting pressure. The Axis side, conversely, struggled with a philosophy of conservation. Their excellent vehicles were too few, too precious and too complex to risk casually. This created a logistical paralysis. They were forced to fight a defensive war not just against enemy soldiers, but against the clock and the dwindling supplies in their own thinly stretched depots. Furthermore, the American focus on vehicle speed and volume allowed for the swift evacuation of the wounded and the rapid movement of specialized units, like field hospitals. This raised troop morale significantly. Knowing that transport was always available, whether for advance or medical retreat, was a powerful psychological edge. This era in Italy became the brutal dress rehearsal for the operation that would ultimately shatter the German war machine. The breakout from Normandy and the creation of the legendary Red Ball Express, a logistical phenomenon that would truly seal the fate of Hitler's Europe. The lesson learned in the Italian mud was simple. In modern war, the side with the most road space and the most reliable vehicles to fill it will always win. The landings at Normandy, while successful, initially led to the slow, agonizing hedgerow-by-hedgerow battle of the Bocage. But once General Patton's Third Army achieved the spectacular breakout at Avranches, Operation Cobra, the war of attrition transformed overnight into a war of relentless movement. This transition was the moment the 500,000 trucks, once ridiculed as propaganda, finally proved their devastating strategic purpose. Suddenly, the American logistical system had to support an army that was advancing 50 miles a day. The front line was leaving its ports and railheads far behind. This was the moment the Red Ball Express was born. The Red Ball Express was not merely a fleet of trucks. It was a highly organized, militarized highway system, running from the Norman beaches and eventually from the captured deep-water port of Cherbourg all the way to the forward depots in eastern France, often a distance of over 400 miles. This operation was a feat of pure, uncompromising American organization and determination. At its peak, the Red Ball Express employed almost 6,000 vehicles, primarily the GMC CCKW, operating on a one-way loop, 2 dedicated military policed routes, one for movement east, one for the return west. This allowed the river of supplies to flow continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was a ribbon of steel and noise, described a German liaison officer stationed near the Meuse River. We could hear it, even without seeing it. A continuous roar. The Americans weren't just supplying their armies, they were moving their entire nation into Europe. Our intelligence reports couldn't keep up with where their tank divisions were because they were moving faster than a motorcycle courier could track them. The strategic impact was simple yet profound. The Red Ball bypassed the crippled European railway system, which the Allies had systematically destroyed to prevent German reinforcement, but which now hampered their own advance. The truck, the humble commodity, became the temporary railway system for an entire continental invasion force. The drivers were a diverse and dedicated group, many of them African-American soldiers of segregated units. A painful irony where men fighting for the freedom of Europe were denied equal rights at home. Yet their commitment was total, driving vehicles under conditions of extreme fatigue, occasionally navigating active combat zones and battling the constant mechanical strain. The numbers are staggering. Total time operational for 83 days. Total cargo, over 412,000 tons delivered. Average daily flow, approx $12,500 tons, the equivalent of a dozen fully loaded cargo ships. This unparalleled logistical support allowed Patton's famous dash across France to remain fueled and armed, catching the German High Command in a state of perpetual strategic shock. The tanks were always refueled. The artillery always had shells. A German general, upon seeing the volume of traffic flowing east, reportedly remarked that the Americans had achieved in 2 months what the Wehrmacht had struggled for 3 years to do in the Soviet Union: maintain a high-speed offensive hundreds of miles from their supply base. The fear and disbelief that began in Sicily had now metastasized into full-blown strategic panic. German engineers, who prided themselves on the superior quality and precision of their vehicles, could not reconcile their technical elegance with the overwhelming vulgar mass of the American output. They realized their mistake. A perfectly engineered machine that cannot be replaced is militarily useless against a simple, robust machine that can be replaced 1,000 times over. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate expression of the American industrial machine, an unstoppable river of supplies, turning the vast expanse of France from a battlefield into a simple logistical problem that the CCKW trucks solved, one tireless mile at a time. The battle was no longer between tank and tank, but between the American assembly line and the entire German war effort. The Red Ball Express eventually wound down as Allied engineers successfully repaired rail lines and captured major ports like Antwerp, making the massive trucking operation redundant. But the impact of the 500,000 trucks was indelible. They had ensured the relentless momentum of the final phase of the war, making the surprise German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, an ultimately doomed effort, as the Americans could resupply their embattled forces far faster than the Wehrmacht. The true legacy of the American logistical strategy is a multifaceted one, encompassing technology, strategy, and the human cost. 1. The technological paradigm shift. The war cemented the concept of total logistics as the defining factor of modern conflict. The Allied victory taught the world that superior mobility and sustained supply can negate an enemy's tactical superiority. The simplicity, ruggedness, and standardization of the GMC CCKW and the Willys Jeep became the blueprint for virtually all post-war military vehicle development, influencing armies worldwide. It proved that a vehicle designed for maximum redundancy and repairability was more valuable than one designed for maximum technical performance. 2. The unseen human effort. The success of the Red Ball Express also became a crucial, though slow and painful, catalyst for social change. The bravery and essential service provided by the segregated African-American truck units, often logging the most difficult and dangerous routes, could not be ignored. Their performance undermined the racist policies that kept the military segregated, laying an undeniable foundation for the eventual integration of the U.S. armed forces in the post-war years. These drivers, the anonymous heroes of the supply chain, paid for Europe's liberation with their endurance and their courage. "We were the engine that moved the army," remarked one Red Ball veteran in a later interview. "They didn't see us as heroes at the time, they saw us as drivers. But a tank is just a statue without fuel, and a rifle is a stick without bullets. We put the lifeblood into the fight." 3. The irony. Concluded, the ultimate irony, the contradiction that began this story, was fully realized. The very machine that Italian and German intelligence dismissed as a cheap commodity, Roosevelt's 500,000 trucks, proved to be the most expensive miscalculation of the war. They had underestimated the power of the American industrial commercial base, failing to see that quantity is a quality unto itself when applied on a scale that defies previous historical understanding. The total cost of this logistical miracle was immense. Thousands of vehicles were lost to enemy action, mechanical failure, or simple abandonment due to the speed of the advance. But every loss was immediately replaced, illustrating the core strategic difference. The Axis conserved. The Allies spent their industrial power to achieve victory. In the end, the spectacular German weapons, the Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet fighter, could only be produced in small numbers, suffered from constant maintenance issues, and often ran out of fuel due to the severed logistical spine. They were marvels of engineering, but strategic failures. The simple, standardized, and endlessly reproducible American truck was the unglamorous, unseen champion of the European war. It didn't win battles with a single shot. It won the war by ensuring that the soldiers who did shoot never ran out of ammunition. It was the foundation of the Allied military edifice, a testament to the power of organization and the staggering force of the assembly line. The rumbling of the deuce and a half was not merely the sound of trucks moving. It was the sound of an entire industrial revolution being deployed, turning a political promise into a terrifying, unstoppable reality that crushed the Axis dream under its heavy six-wheeled tread. The men and women who designed, built, and drove these vehicles remain the true, often forgotten heroes of the war, the silent partners in the victory. If this story of strategic irony, industrial power, and the unseen heroes of the supply line fascinated you, leave a like and share this documentary. And for more deep dives into the technology and human drama that shaped the most critical moments of the 20th century, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more untold stories waiting.